Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good night to all the audience for Borneo Constitutional Rights webinars. This is the third series of our webinar. The title for our webinar tonight is What is Federation of Malaya, States of Malaya and Malaya? So, why did I pick this title, this topic tonight? Because in the social media, in the people out there, they don't know that the terms that they use, like Malaya, States of Malaya, Federation of Malaya, Malaysia, they use the terms inter alia, confusing. They didn't know that each terms have its own constitutional meaning. Each of these terms actually have its own constitutional meanings and constitutional definition. Federation of Malaya have its own meaning. States of Malaya have its own meaning, and Malaya has its own meaning. Also, Malaysia also have its own meaning. So we start tonight. This is the question that we want to ask. What is Federation of Malaysia? What is Federation of Malaya? What is States of Malaya? And what is Malaya? All of these terms have a different meaning. It has a different constitutional meanings for each of these terms. To easily understand what each of these terms means, we look at it through a chronological order. There is an order on how this term come about from the beginning. At first, there is a Federation of Malaya. And then the terms Malaya was coined. And then there is Federation of Malaysia. And then there is States of Malaya. States of Malaya is one of the component unit in the Federation of Malaysia. So to understand the meaning of all these four terms, you need to look at it at a chronological order so that you will not get confused. At first, we look at the constitutional meanings of Federation of Malaya. You know, Federation of Malaya was formed in 1948. Federation of Malaya formed in 1948, but still a colonies of British at that time, because the people in Peninsula here, at the Federation of Malaya here, the Malay state, they refuse they don't want Malayan Union. They want Federation of Malaya 1948. They don't want Malayan Union. So they formed Federation of Malaya 1948. It is this Federation of Malaya 1948 that gained independence and formed a Federation of Malaya 1957. So what is the meaning of Federation of Malaya? To understand the constitutional meaning of Federation of Malaya, we look at the Federation of Malaya Agreement 1948 and the Constitution of the Federation of Malaya 1957 and the Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948. This is Act 388, Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948. So you look at these three documents, constitutional document. Refer to Federal Constitution of Malaya 1957. So what is Federation of Malaya 1948-1957? The interpretation given in Article 1, Clause 2 of the original Constitution of the Federation of Malaya 1957, it said the states of the Federation are Johor, Kedah, Kelantan, Negeri Sembilan, Pahang, Perak, Perlis, Selangor, and Terengganu, formerly known as the Malay States, and Malacca and Penang, formerly known as the settlements of Malacca and Penang. In the Federation of Malaya 1957 Constitution, there is given states of the Federation. So, what is this states of the Federation? To understand what is the states of the Federation, there is also given in the Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948. Exactly the exact word, states of the Federation means state of Johor, Kedah, Kelantan, Negeri Sembilan, Pahang, Perak, Perlis, Selangor, Terengganu, Melaka, and Penang, and all dependency, island, and place which on Merdeka Day, were administered as part thereof and the territorial water yet adjacent thereto. So, and the word the Federation, if we look at Article 160, Clause 2 of the Federal Constitution of the Federation of Malaya 1957, it means the Federation established under the Federation of Malaya Agreement 1957. The same definition is still in our Constitution of Malaysia today. And if we look again in the Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948, Federation means the federation established in accordance with the Federation of Malaya Agreement 1957. So we have our answer here that for Federation of Malaya 1948-1957, the definition was given in Article 1, Clause 2 of Constitution of Federation of Malaya 1957, Article 162. You look at the definition of the federation, and then Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948, you look at the definition for federation and states of the federation, where the federation means the federation established under the Federation of Malaya Agreement 1957. If we look at the map here, so this is Federation of Malaya. The term is Federation of Malaya, not Malaya, not Malaysia, not States of Malaya, Federation of Malaya, Persekutuan Tanah Melayu. So this is Federation of Malaya 1957 if you look at the map. And if you look based on the Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948, all the dependency, island, place on Merdeka Day and the territorial waters. So including the territorial waters of Federation of Malaya. So this is the map of Federation of Malaya. They have their territorial water also for Malaya, for the whole Federation of Malaya. So this is Federation of Malaya, and this is Federation of Malaya with its territorial water, based on the Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948. So now, Federation of Malaya 1957 was created in 1948 and 1957. It's when our Federation of Malaya was formed. Now we look at Malaya. What is Malaya? If we look what is Malaya, you look at also at Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948. This is the ordinance made by the Federation of Malaya 1957. They make this ordinance. So any law before Federation of Malaya get independent, It's called ordinance. After Federation of Malaya gain independent, it's called Act of Parliament. But before Federation of Malaya 1957 gain independent, during this Federation of Malaya 1948, they make an ordinance. It's called Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance. So what it mean of Malaya based on this ordinance? It means the states of federation and Singapore. That is Malaya. States of the federation and Singapore combined. And another constitutional definition is given in the Constitution of the State of Singapore, Article 91, Clause 1 of the Constitution of the State of Singapore. Malaya means Singapore and the Malay Peninsula. And the Malay Peninsula here means Federation of Malaya. I will go explain it later. So this is what it's mean by Malaya. So Malaya is states of the Federation and Singapore. So what is the state of the Federation just now? I already explained what is the state of Federation. State of the Federation is Federation of Malaya. And Singapore in Singapore. And Malaya means State of the Federation and Singapore. So State of Federation is Federation of Malaya plus Singapore. So that is what we call Malaya. Why the term Malaya was coined in this Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948 and in the Constitution of Singapore? Okay, before we answer that question, we look at this one. What is Malay Peninsula? If we look at the Article 91, Clause 1 of the Constitution of the State of Singapore, Malaya means Singapore and the Malay Peninsula. What is the meaning of Malay Peninsula? The meaning of Malay Peninsula, you look at the Malaysia Agreement 1963, Annex D, which is the uh, you look at the sixth schedule of the Malaysia Agreement 1963. You look there at Article 8, Right to Equal Treatment. In Clause 5, for the word Federation, there shall be substitute the words Malay Peninsula. So we look at the Federal Constitution of Malaya, Federation of Malaya, in Article 8, Clause 5. The word Federation has been replaced with the Malay Peninsula. So Article 8 of the former Constitution of the Federation of Malaya 1957 has been amended, where in Article 8, Clause 5, for the words Federation, there shall be substitute the words Malay Peninsula. So the former word is Federation. So what does Federation mean? Federation, in the Federation of Malaya Agreement 1957 Constitution, it's mean the federation established in accordance with the Federation of Malaya Agreement 1957. So the federation here means Federation of Malaya. So it has been substituted with Malay Peninsula. So easily we can understand the framer intention here, that Malay Peninsula means federation. Federation means Federation of Malaya 1957. So the words here, it's give the same meaning. The Malaya means in the Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948 means State of the Federation and Singapore. It's mean Federation of Malaya plus Singapore. So that is Malaya. And Article 91, Clause 1 of the Constitution of the State of Singapore also give the same meaning. Malaya means Singapore and the Malay Peninsula. What is Malay Peninsula? Malay Peninsula is Federation of Malaya plus Singapore, and it is become Malaya. So Malaya is Singapore and Federation of Malaya. So why did the British make this definition in the Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948, and then later they put it in the Constitution of Singapore also, the meaning of Malaya? It is because the British they feel responsible for the separation of Singapore from the Federation of Malaya. When doing they colonized the Federation of Malaya being colonized, Singapore being colonized, they separate these territories. So they feel obligated to merge back all these people and territories because they think they make a mistake when they separated Singapore from the rest of the Peninsula Malaysia, from the rest of the Federation of Malaya. That's why they put their Malaya, so that they want the people to understand. And even the people in the Federation of Malaya and Singapore at the time, they have a wish that one day they will still merge together. That's why they coined the word Malaya there, so that in the future, in Federation of Malaya and Singapore will come back together. Now we look at Federation of Malaysia. Federation of Malaysia was formed in 1963. So what does it mean by Federation of Malaysia? To understand what is Federation of Malaysia, you look at Malaysia Agreement 1963 lah. To understand what is Federation of Malaysia, you look at Article 1 of the Malaysia Agreement 1963. What does it say about Malaysia? It says the colonies of North Borneo and Sarawak and the state of Singapore shall be federated with the existing states of the Federation of Malaya as the state of Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore in accordance with the constitutional instruments annexed to this agreement, and the federation shall thereafter be called Malaysia. So, the constitutional instrument that federated the existing state of Federation of Malaya with state of Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore is Section 4 of Annex A of Malaysia Agreement 1963. So this is the characteristic of the Federation of Malaysia. So the Federation in Section 4, Clause 1 of Malaysia Agreement 1963, Annex A, it said Federation shall be known in Malay and in English by the name Malaysia. So we have a new federation, Federation of Malaysia. And the states of the federation is states of Malaya, Borneo states, and state of Singapore. And clause 3, it said the territories of each of the state before Malaysia Day. So Federation of Malaya 1963, we have 3 states in the Federation of Malaysia, which is states of Malaya, Borneo states, and state of Singapore. So we have 3 states. And all of these 3 states, they have their own territories. Each of the state, Borneo state comprised of Sabah and Sarawak. So territories of the Federation before Malaysia Day, we have States of Malaya, which is based on the Federation of Malaya, which was formed based on Federation of Malaya 1948, 1957. And then we have State of Singapore, 1948. They have their own territory defined at that time. We have State of Sarawak, have our own territories in 1954, and State of Sabah in 1954. I give you the information on the legal instrument of our territories defined. States of Malaya, it was defined in the Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948. So states of Malaya already have their own territory defined in 1948. And Singapore also defined in 1948 based on the Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948. And Sarawak, we have Sarawak Alteration of Boundaries Order in Council 1944. And North Borneo Alteration of Boundaries Order in Council 1954. So we have 4 territories which was made before Malaysia Day based on the based on this section 4 clause 3 just now. The territories of each of the state are the territories comprised therein before Malaysia Day. So all of these territories was defined before Malaysia Day. As you can see, we have three states in Malaysia. However, we have four territories. There is a reason why it was written like that. The reason is decolonization process based on UN Resolution 1541. But I will not go there for this topic. We just want to understand what is Federation of Malaysia in 1963. It was clearly defined here. Federation of Malaysia 1963. Now we look at what is Federation of Malaysia in 1965. So the characteristic of Malaysia keep changing. In 1965, because of the separation of Singapore, there is remaining two states in the Federation of Malaysia, which is States of Malaya and the Borneo state. And this is the map. And if we include the continental shelf, this is the territories of the Federation after the separation of Singapore. We have States of Malaya, State of Sarawak, and State of Sabah. We have our own territorial waters. Each of these states have their own territorial waters based on the legal instrument that I explained just now. So this is the territories of the Federation after the separation of Singapore. And then characteristic of Malaysia changed again in 1976. In 1976, we become like this. This is the new map of Federation of Malaysia 1976. States of the Federation based on Article 1, Clause 2 has been grouped together as Johor, Kedah, Kelantan, Melaka, Negeri Sembilan, Pahang, Penang, Pahang, Penang, Perak, Perlis, Sabah, Sarawak, Selangor, and Terengganu. Everybody has been grouped together. And if we read the constitution, it become like this. It's become a state of the Federation of Malaya, masquerading as Malaysia. But this is the characteristic of Malaysia right now, based on the constitution. But we will not go into detail for this one. We just want to know what is Malaysia. Federation of Malaya, Federation of Malaysia, and all of this legal definition for each of the words, the terms that people always get confused. So now we already know what is Federation of Malaya, Federation of Malaya. Now we want to understand what is States of Malaya. States of Malaya is only formed after Malaysia Agreement was signed. How did that happen? Okay, when Malaysia Agreement was signed, we look at Article 1 of the Malaysia Agreement. The colonies of North Borneo and Sarawak and the state of Singapore shall be federated with the existing states of the Federation of Malaya. So what is this existing states of the Federation of Malaya? If we look at Article 1, Clause 2, Constitution of the Federation of Malaya 1957, the states of the Federation has been grouped there. The formerly non-Malay state, which is Johor, Kedah, Kelantan, Negeri Sembilan, Pahang, Perak, Perlis, Selangor, and Terengganu, and Melaka and Penang, which is formerly known as the Settlement of Melaka and Penang. And in the Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance, states of the Federation also have been defined there. It is a Federation of Malaya 1957. So the existing state of the Federation of Malaya is Federation of Malaya 1957. So this is the exact words, not just make up words. Now, when we form Malaysia, this state of the Federation of Malaya has become State of Malaya based on this Article 1, Clause 2 of Constitution of Federation of Malaya 1957 and Interpretation and General Clause Ordinance 1948. you look at the definition of states of the federation. So you will understand that states of the federation means state of Malaya. What is the difference? What is the difference between definition of states of the federation and states of Malaya? The difference in 1957, you see that there is two units in the state of the federation, which is formerly known as Malay states and settlements. At first, it was grouped like that. Johor, Kedah, Kelantan, Negeri Sembilan, Pahang, Perak, Perlis, Selangor, and Terengganu was grouped as the formerly Malay state. Malacca and Penang, it was formerly known as the settlement. So states of the federation was being grouped like that when the Federation of Malaya 1957 gained independence. You know, when Malaya gained Federation of Malaya gained independence in 1957, there are still strong regionalistic feeling. They have state feeling is very strong. Some people from Kelantan still feeling like they are from Kelantan. From Negeri Sembilan, they want their identity as Negeri Sembilan is very strong. This is a regionalistic feeling in the Federation of Malaya in 1957. So even in the constitution, it was still grouped like that. And then when Malaysia was formed, it becomes states of Malaya. What has changed is that all this group has been removed. All the 11 states of the Malaya have been put in the alphabetical order. One, they have been put in the alphabetical order, and second, all these component unit of settlement and Malay state has been removed. So that they want to reduce the ill feeling between the regional state in the Federation of Malaya at that time. Yeah. Tell you this. So this is what happened when Malaysia Agreement 1963 was signed. Federation of Malaya 1957, and then it became States of Malaya in 1963. It is still the same identity, but the name has been changed. There is a reason where the name has been changed to States of Malaya instead of Federation of Malaya. Why it has been changed after Malaysia Agreement was signed? The reason is this: decolonization process of Singapore and merger. I tell you just now that Malaya is Federation of Malaya plus Singapore. That is Malaya. And the British intention, the mistake that the British feel when they give independence to Federation of Malaya and they separate Singapore from Federation of Malaya, they feel responsible for that separation. So the British have their own intention. They want to rectify their mistake, that their mistake of separating this territory. They want to combine it together. So that's why in one process of decolonization of Singapore, there will be a merger between Singapore and Federation of Malaya later on. I will explain later. So, but first, we understand that Federation of Malaya, when Malaysia Agreement was signed in 1963, it became States of Malaya. So we look at the decolonization process of Singapore. Okay, decolonization process of Singapore is like this. At first, State of the Federation, which is Federation of Malaya 1957, was supposed to be merged with State of Singapore. But when Malayan Union was proposed, Singapore was still separated from Federation of Malaya 1948, Malayan Union 1946 at that time. And then when Federation of Malaya 1948 was formed, Singapore was still separated from the Federation of Malaya. And then when Federation of Malaya gained independence in 1957, Singapore was still separated. But the British want there will be a merger between this territory. The intention of the British is there will be a merger because The British, no, this is their mistake when they separate this territory. And then through Malaysia Agreement, this state of the federation, which is Federation of Malaya, has been changed to States of Malaya. And then as Article 1, Clause 2A and Article 1, Clause 2C, State of Singapore. Remember, when Singapore formed the Federation of Malaysia in 1963, the purpose is to federate it with the states of Malaya and the Borneo state. And the most crucial thing that we must understand is it is for the merger between states of Malaya and Singapore. It was for the merger of the Federation of Malaya and Singapore. And then the British just leave it like that. They doesn't change anything after that. Why? Because we are under the UN Resolution 1541, which is a flexible decolonization process. We have many options to complete our independence. So when Article 1 of the Federal Constitution was originally written, it is for this purpose, for decolonization process. And one part of it is for the decolonization process of Singapore. So for the decolonization process of Singapore, there is two way it will be happen. But it is up to State of Malaya and Singapore to decide. British will not decide for this one to complete the independence. British only form Malaysia as a flexible process for decolonization. So to gain independence, Singapore can either merge with State of Malaya, merger here, and then it will become Malaya. You know, the definition of Malaya is still there. In Singapore Constitution is still there. It means Singapore and Malay Peninsula. It means Singapore and State of the Federation. It means Singapore and Federation of Malaya 1957. That is what it means by Malaya. Maybe this is the one route that Singapore can take when they want to complete the independence for by using a complete merger with State of Malaya. And then it form Malaya. Or they can choose another route which is State of Singapore merge or combine into the states of Malaya and they complete their decolonization process as one of the component states of Malaya. But how they are going to do that, we don't know. The British only left like that, and it's up to them how to decide. And then what happened is that Singapore separate from Malaysia. They don't want complete merger with states of Malaya to form Malaya or join state of Malaya to complete their independence. But they want to complete their independence through separation. It is also can because the purpose of Malaysia formation is for the decolonization process of Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore. Malaysia was not formed because Sabah and Sarawak and Singapore want to join Malaysia. That is not the purpose of the formation of Malaysia. The purpose of Federation of Malaysia was formed is not because we want to Sabah and Sarawak and Singapore want to join Malaya and then form Malaysia. No, that is not the purpose of Malaysia. The purpose of Malaysia is for decolonization process of Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore. This is the purpose of Malaysia. That is why all the Article 1 was written like that. And I tell you about the decolonization process of Singapore here. It is a flexible process based on UN Resolution 1541. So in the end, Singapore make a decision to complete their independent process, to complete the decolonization process through separation. And now they become State of Singapore since 1965. I think that's all for me. So I will just, if you have any question, you can ask in the comment below. But I will just go back from the beginning and tell you what is the definition of all of these words. So all these words have different meaning, have different constitutional meanings. To understand it, you must look at it through chronological order, through historical perspective, through historical timeline. First, it was formed Federation of Malaya, has its own definition. Malaya has its own definition, and then Federation of Malaysia was formed, has its own definition, and then State of Malaya was formed, has its own definition. What is Federation of Malaya? This is Federation of Malaya. If you look at the map of Federation of Malaya, is the Federation of Malaya 1957 consists of 11 states of Malaya, Federation of Malaya. This is the map, and this is the maps of Federation of Malaya with the territorial waters. And then Malaya. What is Malaya? Malaya is State Federation of Malaya plus State of Singapore. So Singapore plus Federation of Malaya is Malaya. So don't get confused. This is Federation of Malaya, only 11 state of Malaya here. And Malaya is Federation of Malaya plus Singapore. That is Malaya. So use the right terms. And then we have Federation of Malaysia. Of course, Federation of Malaysia keep changing. We at first we have this state, three state, Borneo state, Malaya state of Malaya, and Singapore, and state of Singapore. And then we have these territories. We have state of Malaya, which is Federation of Malaya, and then we have state of Singapore, Sarawak, and Sabah. This is the map and the territorial water of each of this state at that time in 1963. And then it kept changing after separation of Singapore in 1965. What's left is state of Malaya and Borneo state with our territory defined here. Three of left territories left there. And then we have new, it keep changing. Federation of Malaysia keep changing its characteristic. Identity is keep changing. Now in 1976, we become like this. State of the Federation of Malaya masquerading as Malaysia. If you look at the definition of the federation in the Article 160, Clause 2 of the Federal Constitution. So our identity, Malaysia, Federation of Malaysia, the identity keep changing. It's not good. You are like chameleon. Like, I don't know what, like Sajat, the identity keep changing. You ask your YB, why they keep changing your identity like this? So this is States of Malaya. States of Malaya is Federation of Malaya. When Malaysia Agreement was signed, it became States of Malaya. So Federation of Malaya, it's become States of Malaya. The purpose is for decolonization process of Singapore. That's why Federation of Malaya 1957 now becomes States of Malaya 1963. It is for the purpose of decolonization process of Singapore, so that it can provide for complete decolonization, complete merger of Singapore with the states of Malaya. But in the end, Singapore separated from Malaysia, so all this process that was intended by the British to merge states of Malaya and Singapore has failed. Singapore choose for their own independence. Okay, if there is any question? No, so far? Okay, I think that's all for tonight. It's been 43 minutes. It's enough. Okay, thank you for watching, and I will keep you up to date with my next webinar, maybe next week, or maybe I will make it every day based on my availability. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share this webinar to your friends. Thank you. Good night, and that's all.